All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. It's about 1 minute after 1. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. I am Ann Lotch with the National Clearinghouse on Abusive Later Life, and this is our annual Stalking in Older Adults webinar. I love presenting this topic with Dana. Dana is we'll introduce Dana in a second, but it's always as fun as a webinar on stalking can be. So I really appreciate the interest, and we're happy that you're here today for the next 90 minutes to learn more about stalking in older adults. As you know, if you've ever attended an NCAL event before, we are supported by grants from the Office on Violence Against Women, and the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations that you will hear today are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the DOJ Office on Violence Against Women. My name is Ann Lotch. I'm the Justice System Coordinator for the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. I've been working on this project for about 6 years, and my work revolves around older adults, elder abuse, and anything related to the justice system. So we do a lot of training of law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, and working with communities all over the country to help them better respond to older victims and enhance victim safety and offender accountability. So that's who I am. I will turn it over to Dana to introduce herself.
Right. Hi, all, and thanks. And I echo Ann. It's always a pleasure doing this webinar with Ann, and it's always fun to talk stalking, especially with Ann and NCAL. So my name is Dana Flightman. I'm the Training and Awareness Specialist at the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, or SPARC, which is a project of Equitas, also funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. And as the technical assistance provider on stalking, we're really tasked with helping folks recognize and respond to stalking. So I provide a lot of training to victim services professionals, campuses, criminal justice folks, and others around that response, as well as leading our public awareness efforts, particularly in January, when, in case you didn't know, it is National Stalking Awareness Month. So an especially good time to be doing this session. So just a little bit more about SPARC. I think if you go to the next slide, Ann. Our website. I also want to say we're so grateful to NCAL for highlighting stalking, because stalking's often left out of our conversation when we're talking about elder abuse, domestic violence, or other related crimes. And, you know, we want to remember there's 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act, right? It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. But it's always kind of like, and stalking, like we almost called our website andstalking.org. So, you know, we really appreciate the opportunity and the interest here. And my hope is that, look, you're the ones doing this work every day. My hope is just that by the end of the session, you'll kind of move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of the sentence and see the great work that you're already doing through that lens a little bit. And hopefully you'll want more resources and to follow up with us. And so when you want to do that, our website is stalkingawareness.org. We did not go with andstalking.org. We have practitioner guides broken out by discipline. So we have for victim services, for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for awareness educators. We have training modules. So if you do any kind of community education, lunch and learn, that kind of thing, we have programs you can just pick up and lead. We have discussion guides on the show you, and other videos and things you could just do without having to reinvent the wheel. We have victim resources, so we are not a direct service provider, but we know that victims come to our site just for information on stalking. So we have resources, for example, these prep brochures on understanding stalking that you can order from us for free, so you have something to hand those stalking victims, as well as infographics, fact sheets, and some general safety planning guidance, and webinars like this one. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck, because we have our recorded archive of webinars, and we're called SPARC, so I got us to call it the SPARchives. So that was pretty much the pinnacle of my professional achievement. So you can check us out in the SPARchives for a bunch of recorded webinars. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally, if you get our 6 sense of humor at SPARC. If not, it'll be a long 90 minutes for you. So really your call either way. But I hope that you will connect with us, especially this month, but year round, just to keep stalking top of mind. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you without your consent. So you have to actually sign up for our newsletter. So I hope that you'll do that. We don't send it a lot, maybe about quarterly. So that's us. And I hope this is just the beginning of our relationship and that you do follow up and keep in touch with us.
Thank you, Dana. I totally co-sign everything you said, that your website has so many great resources and stuff that is really practical and helpful for our work. So as you start to integrate stalking more into your thinking about what comprises elder abuse, don't forget about Spark. Many of you know the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life is the comprehensive technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women Abuse in Later Life grant program. I know that there are lots of grantees on the call today. I'm glad you're here. Since 1999, we have been the only national organization that provides technical assistance, training, and consultation on the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse. We are a national project. We have 6 staff, some of whom work out of our home office or our hometown of Madison, Wisconsin. We also have staff in Milwaukee, me, in Nevada, in Georgia, and where else am I forgetting? I guess that's it. So anyway, we're across the country. We do work in service of our mission in a number of areas and contexts related to abuse in later life. We do this work as a team and also through various collaborations, including this one with Spark. So we are super happy to be part of this today. This is what we are going to, hopefully you'll come away with today. After this session is over, we expect that you'll be better able to recognize stalking behavior, understand how stalking impacts older adults, and identify some resources to improve your response or your organization's response to stalking in later life. I'm gonna start with an overview of elder abuse, and then we'll get into the specifics of stalking, the definition of stalking, prevalence, dynamics unique to stalking, what are its implications for older adults, and what are some resources that are available to you and to communities to respond to stalking or prevent stalking. So let's just jump right in. Talking about starting with the definition of elder abuse. If you are a grantee who's been around for a long time, you're going to recognize this definition. In 2014, the elder justice field produced something called the Elder Justice Roadmap, which you can find if you Google that. It's a great publication, and it defined elder abuse as the physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, as well as neglect, abandonment, and financial exploitation of an older person by another person or entity that occurs in any setting, home, community, facility, either in a relationship where there should be an expectation of trust, or when an older person is targeted because of their age, their disability. So as you can imagine, in terms of statutory schemes and legislative definitions of elder abuse, you're going to find definitions that differ from this. There is not one set definition of elder abuse. Additionally, for those of you working in organizations, you may have a particular definition that you use to categorize a situation as elder abuse. So we just want to recognize that, in addition to all those definitions, there is that people might use different definitions in their work. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about this definition. For me, what I like to pull out of this is there are a couple things. First of all, that it can occur in any setting. When I tell people what I do for work, people are always like, oh yeah, nursing homes, they're the worst. And 4% of older adults live in nursing homes. It's a very, very small percentage of abuse that occurs. The vast majority of abuse in later life occurs in the community, in homes, and next door to you. So it's not just nursing homes. And the other factor I like to pull out is that expectation of trust. So at least for our purposes, we're not going to be talking about scams, stranger scams, the guy who calls and says, oh, your computer needs attention right now, let me help you with that. We're talking about relationships where there is an expectation of trust, whether that is a parent-child relationship, another family member, somebody with a fiduciary duty to that older family. So just want to point out that is really the context of what we are going to talk about. Dana's going to talk in more detail about the definition of stalking. But before she does, I want to share just a couple statistics to set the stage about what we're seeing around older adults and abuse in later life. And it's going to give you some context and highlight just the importance of focusing on older survivors. The first statistic, which many of you have seen before, is from a national study done about 8 years ago. 1 in 10 older adults residing in the community, so not in a facility or care facility, reported experiencing abuse in the past year. And that number is striking because it is only going to include people who had the economic, physical, and psychological resources to report abuse, right? We know very well that much of that abuse is hidden. It means that they had a phone, they were willing and able to pick up the phone and talk to a safe person and reach out in some way for help. So that 1 in 10 obviously does not include those older adults living in facilities and who are even more vulnerable. So this number says 1 in 10. In my mind, that's a huge, huge underestimation of the scope and scale of the actual issue. Because statistic number 2, we also know that for every, this is what folks at Lifespan in Rochester, their research has shown, that for every case of elder abuse that does come to the attention of a responsible entity, there are 24 that do not. If we're talking only about financial exploitation, that number is 1 in 44. So this is why we love our iceberg slide. It does go to show you that the cases you hear about are truly the tip of the iceberg. So to really talk about the issue of victimization of older adults as it relates to stalking, I think that there's no better way to do that than by centering the voice of a survivor herself. So we are going to hear from a survivor named Velva, who was an 86-year-old stalking victim, and she is going to talk about her experience. So we will listen to Velva.
Over the course of 9 months, 86-year-old Velva Norenberg was stalked, but local law enforcement was not able to identify a pattern of stalking.
My house has been robbed and robbed and robbed. My things have been taken and moved, and he seemed to enjoy being in my house when I was there. He used his trusty screwdriver and pried out the lock. My back door looks like a beaver had chewed it. After he quit breaking in, he'd just come in the yard and watch me through the window. Maybe rattle a doorknob before he left to let me know he was there. Until the last time he broke in, he tapped on the glass.
Law enforcement repeatedly responded to Velva's home for the robberies, but the items stolen were of little value.
Panty girdles, hand lotion. First he started in on the pantyhose and panty girdles. He took 3 panty girdles, and I'd say at least 15 or 20 pair of pantyhose.
That nothing of value was taken from Velva's house, that windows weren't broken, although the door jambs were just chewed up by the screwdriver. I think there was discounting the impact of the crime, and Velva was very calm, and I think that her behavior was a bit different from what people expect from victims.
It's easy to not take it seriously, to say, oh, it's just pantyhose, it's a sort of a silly thing. The items taken were sexual in nature, and let's face it, we have a whole history of believing that the peeping Tom is something almost to be laughed at.
The phone calls Velva received, sometimes 10 or more in one day, were of a sexual nature as well.
He was always so in love with me, he was coming over. Well, now, I definitely am not in love with some young man. I don't care how much he loves me. I didn't love him or had any intention of having anything to do with him, and I told him so. But he would call, oh, lady, you've got the most beautiful body.
I think her home became a far less safe place for her.
He asked me if I was still sexually active and how long since I'd had intercourse. I figured that was none of his business, and I didn't want to listen anymore, so I hung up.
It may be somewhat amusing to hear an 87-year-old woman say, he said he wanted to make love to me. But when you put that in context and you think about the man behind those words and the kind of danger that he could pose to anybody,
it makes you creepy. Your privacy is invaded. Somebody thinks he knows more about you than you do. I don't like that.
This defendant in 1983 had been convicted for assault with intent to rape with an elderly person in the same area.
Law enforcement response to the danger was delayed by the inability to recognize the calls and harassment as the felony crime of stalking. As is common, this was partly due to the fact that different officers responded each time.
It wasn't until the 9th response by law enforcement that somebody finally put it together that this was a pattern of behavior. Her age was against her. People tend to discount what an older woman is saying.
They didn't rush off. They were very polite and very nice. But as I say, it was an incident and it was over.
Really listen to your victim. Don't go into the situation with preconceived notions or some idea of a quick fix, because usually there isn't one. But your role as a law enforcement officer is so crucial in dealing with this problem.
I got a feeling that they really were trying to help me, but they helped me through the incident, but there was no follow-through. After several times, I even wrote a report and mailed it to the police department saying how many times I'd been entered, what had been taken.
And I think Velva's log that she kept every time there was an attempted break-in or phone calls or anything really was a visual representation that somebody could look at and say, this is a pattern of behavior. We're dealing with more than a single incident.
A young police officer handed me his card, and then he said, I think this should be turned over to some special division for investigation.
Although no one knew the stalker's identity, the police investigator tracked down a suspect who had been convicted of similar crimes in the past.
So let me go back here for a second. What really strikes me about, and I'm sure I'm not alone here, strikes me about this video is that for 9 months she was stalked. And she was persistent enough to call law enforcement each time. And yet they were, quote, not able to identify a pattern of stalking. I just think about all the victims who may not have been as persistent, or who may have given up, or who may have just thought, well, they're not going to help me, so it's just something that I have to live with. And you know, there are plenty of people like that out there. So I think that, because the items that he stole were of little value, I think that may have resulted in the officers discounting her story. And, it's just very, very frustrating, but it's also really illustrative of the experience that someone can go through. And I think she's a great example of Dana's going to talk a little bit about keeping a log in a little while. And I think I really admire Velva for being willing to tell her story in this format and for letting us use it, but also her persistence in getting some attention and some help with this issue. So want to start talking a little bit about your experiences. Anna is going to launch a poll here. Oh, and I forgot to acknowledge Anna. Anna is our training and technical assistance specialist. She is doing behind the scenes stuff today. If you have any issues, like tech issues during this, you can send her a message in the chat, but we wouldn't be here without Anna's assistance today. So she is going to launch a poll. Just wondering if the folks that are on the webinar today, as far as you know, have you ever worked with a survivor who is an older survivor who is experiencing stalking? We'll give you guys a minute to respond to the poll. It looks like most people have participated. So 12 of you, 35% of you said yes, you have. And then another 21% are unsure. And then 15 of you guys said no, you have not. Very interesting. So as we go through the next section of the webinar, we hope that maybe some of you who think that they have not had that experience of working with somebody who is a stalking survivor might realize that maybe it was, or might learn something that may make you think, okay, this is actually a lot more common than I'm thinking that it is. So good. Thank you for that. We can move on. Let's see. So I am going to turn it over to Dana at this point. She's going to get into defining stockings and stalking and talk about some of the key dynamics, not stockings. That's a whole different webinar.
That's true. Yeah, thanks so much, Anne. And there's so much in that Velva video that I'll definitely be referring back to throughout because it illustrates this so well. But one thing I just want to highlight here is the urgency of stalking, that, stalking is an important thing to understand, that it is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It's a crime in all 50 states. It's a crime in the District of Columbia and U.S. territories, on tribal lands, and in the military justice system. If you want to go to the next, sorry, we're sharing slide duties here, so wait a second. So it might be a misdemeanor, it might be a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime across the board. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is actually criminal. And so you have victims saying, well, what, should I call the police because somebody keeps driving by my house or keeps texting me and I'm getting a little freaked out here? And of course, a lot goes into a victim's decision to engage with law enforcement or not, but a lot of victims don't even realize they could, or that they're entitled to a criminal justice response, because so many don't realize that stalking, whether it co-occurs with physical violence or not, is a crime on its own. And it is traumatic. So a lot of times when I do hear stalking mentioned in our fields, people kind of go right to that co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is really important. I'll talk about it in just a couple slides. But I want to pause here and point out that even if the stalking in no way intersects with physical violence, it's a crime in its own right because it is deeply traumatic for victims and survivors. So many survivors experience mental health issues that can be lifelong, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression. If you think about being in that heightened state of waiting for the other shoe to drop, what we call that anticipatory fear, right? And maybe you've had a situation like that, like you're waiting for an important call from the hospital, or an email about a job you really want. You're in that kind of heightened state where any second something could happen. We have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. So you can imagine the psychological toll that could take. Like Velva's case, that was 9 months. The average duration of a stalking case is 2 years. So it can be from an afternoon to lifelong. And you can imagine the kind of toll that can take. Many lose time from work. So 1 in 8 employed stalking victims lose some time. About half of those lose 5 days or more. And stalking victims are not typically a protected class of worker. So if that victim goes to their supervisor and says, hey, here's what's going on. Could I switch shifts or could I not answer the front desk phone? The employer can accommodate them, or they can say that's annoying, you're fired. Typically they can do that. That victim will not have any recourse. And quite a few relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if it's all a good thing, still to pack your stuff and get your family together, it's expensive, it's stressful. It's not something you do because someone's kind of annoying you, right? I think it speaks to a much bigger level of trauma and emotional distress. And we have 1 in 7 stalking victims relocating to get away from these offenders. It's always good to hear from. Wait a second. So, and sorry, I forgot. So it's traumatic and scratch all that. It is dangerous. So it often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or harm their victims directly. And in 76% of intimate partner femicide, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often these early signs are dismissed as, oh, it's just calling, it's just following, it's just looking in a window. No one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this one wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. It is these different incidents adding up and escalating over time, not always right in a straight line, right? There might be periods of dormancy. There might be periods where they were showing up in person. Now they're just texting. Maybe they're backing off, but now they're back doing something else and overall escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying that every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide or violence. That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases of homicide or violence, attempted homicide or violence, and at that point, responders are looking back and saying, oh, there's this whole history of stalking here. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not managed with the urgency that it really deserved. We don't want to do that, right? We don't want to wait till there's violence and look backwards. We want to identify stalking and intervene then and look ahead, because it's one of the few crimes that gives us that opportunity, where early identification and intervention can prevent trauma, violence, and possibly even death. And yet that doesn't happen enough because it's quite underreported in our field, similar to domestic and sexual violence. So I'll turn it back to Anne to talk about why that might be.
Excellent. Thanks, Dana. So yeah, we want to talk a little bit about the reporting of stalking by victims. We know that fewer than half of stalking victims report to the police. So thinking about older victims, why might, and you can put your responses in the chat. I'll give you guys a couple minutes, but why might elderly victims be reluctant to contact the police? What barriers could they face in doing so? See what ideas you guys have. Looks like a couple people are typing. So shame, right? I agree. They might be embarrassed. They might, ooh, you guys are going fast. They may not, this is really good, a good observation. They may not recognize that what is happening to them is stalking. They might think it's annoying. They might really hate that guy who's always hanging around outside, but they might not think of it as stalking, or may not recognize it as a crime. Judy, excellent. Fear of escalating the violence, fear that it's just going to make it worse. Fear they won't be believed due to their age, right? We're going to talk a lot about ageism. So spot on, Sarah. Self-blame. Am I doing something? I brought this on myself. I'm sure this is my own fault. My gosh, so common. Really good observation. Fear of not being believed. I think there's, we could talk about this all day, but I think there's internalized ageism, right? Why would somebody want to stalk me? Well, that is false, because it's not because it's an ageist assumption that we make that, oh, stalking victims all look like they do on the TV show You, if any of you guys have seen that. And it's untrue. They're afraid to use the resource. Again, a fear of not being believed. Don't want neighbors to see the police at their house or apartment. That's excellent. I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to be embarrassed. You guys could just do this presentation, I think. They may have prior negative experiences with law enforcement. Excellent. Many folks do, and they just don't want to go down that road at all. Maybe they have tried to tell family members about it, but they're being told, oh, you're just being overly sensitive. That's not really happening. Minimizing, oh, you guys are really, really good. Fear they will be judged. What if the offender is a family member, an intimate partner, somebody that they know? Maybe it's someone they care about who is engaging in this behavior, and they want them to stop, but they don't want them to go to jail. I think that's extremely common in all forms of elder abuse. They might fear their loss of independence. Okay, you guys are doing my job for me here. This is excellent. So I'm going to go forward because I think that you guys have touched on most of these. So some of the reasons that an older adult might not disclose. Maybe they are minimizing, like we talked about, minimizing or is uncertain of the behaviors. Like, I don't think that's a crime, or he's just coming around here a lot because, he likes me or whatever. So maybe they're minimizing what's really happening. Maybe they did report to somebody, but had a negative reaction from that person or did not receive help. That's why I always think it's so amazing that Velva managed to go back 8 times to keep making those reports, even though nobody seemed to connect the dots except her. Maybe the victim is isolated. We know, and we've talked so much about this in the context of this pandemic, which increased isolation for older adults exponentially. But maybe the victim is isolated and they don't know who to talk to or how to make a report, or they just think that nobody is going to come help them because this has been their experience before. So you guys touched on many of these. Again, fear of loss of independence. What if I report to somebody and they think that I've done something here and they don't think that I have my act together enough to stay in my own home? Like, I don't want to lose my home. I'm just going to put up with this. You guys brought up, what if the offender is a family member, intimate partner, or caregiver, someone they don't want to see go to jail, but they do want the behavior to stop. Or they may not understand technology. They may not fully know, they may not even be aware that the stalking has occurred to the degree that it is occurring, because I have a family member who was exploited with technology recently, and a lack of understanding of how to use things or how vulnerable you actually are online is certainly a common dynamic. Excellent. Dana's going to talk a little bit about this domestic violence crime study right now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ann, and for everyone chiming in. It definitely helps us to see responses and know we're not just talking into the void. So I appreciate folks in the chat. But like you all pointed out, there's so many reasons why victims may not report. We know it's underreported for all the reasons that you said, especially that minimization, the fear of minimization from the responder. Another big reason is this lack of evidence, feeling I can't prove it, so what's the point? But let's say they do report. So this was a study in the state of Colorado, about 1,800 cases of domestic violence, about 300 involved clear documented evidence of stalking reported to law enforcement. So like we all just said, that's not always happening, right? But that is happening here, where we have that evidence of stalking in law enforcement hands. How many of these 298 cases do you think were charged as stalking? I got a stalking charge for that offender. It was one. Only one case was actually charged as stalking. And look, a lot goes into charging decisions. I understand that, but we need to recognize that absolutely on the victim and public awareness end, this isn't always, stalking's not always identified, but also on that responder end in both our criminal justice system and in our victim service provider field, stalking is often missed as a form of victimization that we need to address, either with safety planning and resources and or with charging and offender accountability. But it's okay, we're gonna fix it today. So I wanna talk a little bit about what stalking is. We keep saying it's so bad we have to do something. Well, what is it exactly? There's the behavioral definition and the statutory definition. Just like with elder abuse, your different states will have different statutes to make it, fun and interesting. Some are broader, some are more narrow. It's important to know your state statute on stalking because some of them match up with that behavioral definition really well and some don't. And so if you're working with a victim, it's important to be able to articulate, hey, what you're experiencing is stalking. And if you go down the street to law enforcement, they may or may not say it meets their threshold for that statute, right? If that's necessary in your state. So it's good to know both, and you can definitely reach out if you want to talk statute. But today, since we have a national audience and we're really talking mostly about victim safety, we're going to focus on the behavioral definition because that gives a sense of what stalking really looks like and what stalkers really do. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and all these scenarios are bummers, okay? We don't like any of these situations, but which of them are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. And so I'll just kind of read these out and you can vote. I'm making you choose yes or no because I'm very mean. You can't say maybe or I need more information. So this first one, a staff member hides a camera in the women's locker room to watch the women undress. It goes undiscovered for months. Does that sound like stalking to you? Yes or no? The second one, an ex-partner spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking to you? Yes or no? And lastly, this terrible supervisor asking her employee personal questions, mocking him in meetings, sending emails at weird hours, being verbally abusive when he doesn't respond right away. Does that sound like stalking? So I know it's a bunch of questions, so I'll give you another minute here to respond. And like I said, I know that a lot of you might want to click maybe, but I'm being very mean, so I'm making you choose. So give me another few seconds here. Right. I'm shutting the poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So as you can see, we split the room here, right? So this first one with the camera, most folks are saying, hey, that sounds like stalking. About a third saying no. The second one, we're about half and half, with more people saying yes with that bad partner. And that terrible supervisor, most folks saying, yeah, that sounds like stalking, and about a fifth saying no. So thanks for doing that. And of course, it's nice when we're in person and can discuss it a little bit more. But my guess is a few things came up for you just on your own thinking through these, like, okay, well, what else was going on here? You know, how many times does this have to happen for it to be stalking? Could it be at anyone in the locker room, or does it have to be directed at one person? So I'm going to go through the behavioral definition and use these examples in here. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break this down a little bit more, it's a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or a one-off event. You can go to the next slide here, Anne. Thanks. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today: pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's 2 or more incidents that make up that pattern. In most state statutes, it's also 2 or more. In a few states, it's 3 or more. And those behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Anne because I'm the worst presenter ever, okay? And so maybe Monday I text Anne, Tuesday I'm mad she didn't respond, so I smash her headlights. Then Wednesday I feel bad about that, so I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, right? And so stalkers often combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, especially property crimes, like that property damage. And we saw that with Velva's case, right? Those break-ins or attempted break-ins, taking things of little value, but that theft, etc. Often stalkers do that as well as other behaviors that aren't crimes on their own, but can become criminal as part of a stalking course of conduct. And that's really confusing because it's not illegal to text somebody. It's not illegal to send somebody a gift, but it is illegal to stalk somebody, right? And so a lot of times what we'll encourage is, when you're responding to a victim, our system tends to be quite incident-based. And we saw that with Velva's case, right? They literally said to her, okay, we responded to that incident, right? So if something happens, we respond to that incident. What I encourage you to do is take a step back and think, what else is going on here? Is this actually an isolated incident, or is it part of a bigger course of conduct? Because a victim may or may not think to disclose to you, yeah, they smashed my headlights and they've been calling me a lot, and I've been getting these weird packages, and they keep driving by my house. They may or may not think that's relevant to disclose to you, whether as law enforcement or as a victim service provider, but it is relevant because it shows that, hey, it's not just this one thing, it's part of this pattern of behavior. But often these stalking crimes come in as property crimes, and we tend to focus on the most obvious thing. So we can all see that smashed headlight, we get it, right? We can see it. Easier to prove, easier to understand, but I'll encourage you to take a step back and say, what's going on in this pattern of behavior? And it's directed at a specific person. And so if you think of like the scenarios where in the first one, someone's putting a camera in the locker room, that sounds like a crime to me, absolutely. It's probably not stalking if they weren't targeting anyone specific. And so because with a stalking crime, you're targeting a specific person. If you go to the next slide. So if I'm, an offender and I put a camera in the locker room, for anyone who happens to be there, that's not really stalking. Now, it could totally become stalking. Let's say that offender then retrieves the camera, finds footage of a particular person in the locker room, finds them on social media and contacts them and says, hey, you better XYZ or I'll release this video. Okay, now we could be looking at stalking and extortion and other things because we have 2 or more incidents and it's directed at a specific person or people. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe an offender is targeting, say it's their ex-partner. Ex-partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now they're targeting their ex and the ex's new romantic interest. And a stalker is likely to reach out to a victim's network, so their family, friends, colleagues, children, others, to try to get information about that victim. But we still see that as directed at a specific person because those other people might be involved and even considered co-victimized, but that offender's trying to get to that person and they might use other people to do it. But they're really trying to get to that victim or victims. And so we see it as directed at a specific person. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So fear is really important to understanding stalking, and it's what separates stalking from a behavior that it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel angry, annoyed, frustrated, create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is emailing me at 3 a.m. and then calling me names at the staff meeting at 9, like, she's terrible and I hate her and my life is miserable and I'm very upset, I'm not necessarily afraid of her. I'm just like, she's the worst. But let's say that I'm driving home. I think I see her car a couple back. She emails me a picture of myself walking my dog and says, why are you doing that instead of working? She emails my husband. I don't even know how she got his email. Now I'm scared, right? So I'm like, oh my goodness, like, this person seems really fixated on me. What do they want from me? What is the end game here, right? And so harassment can absolutely become stalking or be part of a stalking course of conduct, but they're a little bit distinct in that fear and emotional distress piece that is integral to stalking. And it's not just a semantic difference, it matters because typically our stalking victims are at higher risk than our harassment victims in terms of assessing the level of potential victimization they might be experiencing. And from a criminal justice perspective, stalking is typically a higher charge than harassment. And so we want to be able to plan for victim safety and offender accountability as effectively as possible. And that means naming stalking when we see it. And when we talk about emotional distress, we're really talking about fear. So it's really fear of your physical safety. And when I think about emotional distress, I think about fear around emotional safety. And I don't mean that in a touchy-feely way, like everyone feels good all the time. Emotional safety is about, do you feel you can live your life in a normal way? Do you feel that you're under surveillance, that your life is being invaded, that you're being sabotaged or interfered with, or that you're being intimidated? Or because we have some victims where their fear isn't of bodily harm, but it might be of losing custody of their children. It might be of an intimate photo being disclosed. It might be of never being left alone again, right? So those kind of fears we're including here when we talk about that emotional distress, as well as fear for their safety or safety of others. And so context is really important to understanding stalking, and fear is tough because what's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa, right? And so, for example, this was a case, this woman called the police. She was hysterical. And all she'd say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem, lady? And eventually she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out it was a stalking survivor who had relocated to get away from the offender, address confidentiality, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that day. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So for the folks I can see on camera, they're going like, no, right? And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. I'm being very generous and assuming Anne and Anna are reasonable people, right? It's really scary when we know the whole story. But if all we see is this artifact of the coffee in the car with no other explanation, we're like, what's the big deal? It's winter. That sounds great. Like, we have no idea what the problem is. So it's really that context being so critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what's scariest to a victim may seem benign or even nice to an outsider. And so just a little bit to recognize here that those behaviors might only have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic example is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? And so the victim gets roses, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, this is so lovely, because they don't know that meaning. And so if you're ever working with a victim and they seem very afraid or upset, even if it doesn't make a ton of sense to you at first, what you want to do is ask about the context. So ask them, okay, what message did that send to you? What's the story behind that? Tell me more about that, because it may not be immediately apparent, but if a victim's afraid or in distress, they probably know something you don't. There's probably something going on, and there's a reason they're having that reaction. But is it fear? So we know that when some victims come to us, they seem afraid, quote unquote, right? They might have an affect that suggests that. But like they said in the Velva video, well, she seemed really calm. She didn't have much of an affect, and that's not what people were expecting. And we see that being used to minimize and silence our stalking victims, because we know that when most victims report to you, they're not going to use the words fear or stalking, right? They're not going to call you and say, hey, I'm experiencing a course of conduct directed at me, a specific person, that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking behavior. If they do, please call me. I'll be like, our awareness month is so good. But they probably are not going to say that. They're going to say something like, my ex is being creepy, my neighbor's being weird, an old friend's harassing me, the supervisor's making things awkward. And it's up to us to be thinking, okay, could this be fear and could this be stalking? Because as a culture, we don't necessarily love to use words like fear and afraid. We are more likely to say something like, I'm concerned, I'm confused, I'm frustrated, I'm worried. And of course, we know that victims respond to trauma differently. Some might present as really angry, some might be sad, some might be laughing about the whole thing. It doesn't mean that it's not fear and that it's not stalking. We also see quite a bit of minimization. So like you all mentioned earlier, as a reason for not reporting, there's that fear of minimization of others, but also victims themselves often really minimize what's going on as a response to this repeated trauma. So for example, I talked to this law enforcement officer who shared the story with me. They said they got a call from a victim who was kind of they were the regular point of contact, and the victim was in a really good mood. And the victim said, I think today is going to be a great day. He's only driven by my house 10 times. And the officer's like, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. It's 9 a.m. That's terrible. And the victim was like, oh, but usually by this point, he's driven by like 25 times. So I think it's going to be a low-key day. So it's not that this victim's unreasonable, right? But she is responding to repeated trauma by normalizing what to most of us would be very scary. And so that's where behaviorally that reasonable person standard is actually kind of helpful, because if you're talking to a victim and they're saying, oh, no, it's fine, you can kind of take a step back and be like, is it? If I told this to a room full of people, would they be like, that's actually terrifying? If so, we might really be looking at stalking behavior and recognizing, that minimization can have a huge impact on how people are experiencing or expressing fear. So stalking is really, really prevalent. At least 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking in the United States. And also, we know people of all gender identities experience stalking, absolutely. This is the best available national data, so that's why I'm, presenting it to you in this binary way. And we know this is underreported, just like Anne was talking about earlier with elder abuse, right? Where, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg here for a variety of reasons. But even if we take this at its word, okay, more than 1 in 6 women experiencing stalking, so elder abuse is impacting around 1 in 10 folks, reported, all that, domestic violence is impacting around 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending what study you look at. Sexual assault's impacting around 1 in 5 women. So stalking's really right up there in terms of prevalence. And yet for so many folks that I encounter, this is their when I'm talking to them, it's the first stalking training. There's few, if any, standalone stalking resources, right? It's typically housed under domestic or sexual violence. There's no national stalking hotline. And there's only one national organization working on stalking, and it is a project of another organization, and I am a third of it. So not that we have a chip on our shoulder or anything, but just to show that, this is something that's prevalent, that's happening with the victims and survivors that you're working with, but so often it's not identified, and it's really hard for these survivors to know where exactly to go. And so again, people of all genders experience stalking, absolutely, but women are more likely than men to experience it. And the majority of victims report that the offender is male. That's true regardless of the victim's sexual orientation. And that includes 87% of stalkers over age 60 reporting that the offender is male. Overwhelmingly, female victims report the offender is male over 80% of the time, but also about half the time, male victims report that their offender is male. So why is that happening? Why are men stalking other men? Well, some of that might be from the gay community, and we know that our LGBT folks have higher rates on average than our heterosexual and or cisgender folks. But we also see that target dispersion I talked about earlier. So maybe you have, say, an ex-husband stalking an ex-wife. She gets a new partner. Okay, now he's stalking the new boyfriend as well. And so we do see that quite a bit as men stalking other men. And of course, everyone can stalk everyone, and they do. But overwhelmingly, we do see men stalking women here. So speaking of what we see, when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. So you get a lot of these like alleyway stranger shadow hoodies. I like this one on the middle left that's wearing a hoodie and a mask and behind a computer, but did not cover their webcam. So, you get these kind of creepy strangers, very similar to the stranger rapist myth that you might be familiar with. And, well, yes, strangers can stalk. I'm sure it will not surprise you at all to know on this call that this is not accurate, right? That in reality, the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the offender knows the victim. So I know you're like, duh, Dana, obviously, why are you even talking about this? Like, I know because I'm in the field, that's very clear. But when I'm talking about stalking outside of the field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, people are shocked by this because when most people think stalking, this is what they're thinking of. They're thinking of a shadowy stranger or like a secret admirer sending them a ransom style note from magazines, or a celebrity stalker, like an obsessed fan, right? And all those things can happen. That's not really what we're talking about. And so we'll have victims say, oh, that's not a stalker. That's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Well, guess what? That's the most likely person to engage in stalking behavior. If you can go to the next slide here, it'll show that over half the time, the stalker is a current or former intimate partner, right? So it's that ex-spouse, ex-romantic partner in some way. Though I also want to make the point strongly that if half the time the stalker is related to intimate partner violence, that's a big piece of it, right? About half the time that's true, but it also means about half the time it's not. It could be an acquaintance. It may be a stranger, though it's relatively rare. It might be a family member or a person of authority, like a supervisor, a law enforcement officer, or someone who has some kind of power, right? And so I encourage you to think about in your program, are you serving all victims of stalking, those that are intimate partner violence related and those that are not? Because typically our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence services. That's where we'd refer folks to. And that's not wrong, but it is a little bit incomplete. And it also makes it harder for stalking victims to find the help they need. Because if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged neighbor, and there was never any sexual or romantic relationship, I'm unlikely to pick up the phone and call the domestic violence service locally by me, right? But that's where the response probably is. That's where the advocate is who could help me figure out my safety plan and connect to legal resources, et cetera. So I encourage you to just think through all those scenarios. And if we look at our older stalking situations, and I will say this is coming from one stalking study, Stalking and Age, which is a wonderful study, but it's also one study. There's only one study I know of that is breaking out stalking behaviors by age. So of course, this gives us great information, and we want to recognize that we need more research on this, right? So I just want to kind of frame that appropriately. But this is showing us that actually the rates look a little bit different for our older populations, that we're seeing more acquaintances, about a quarter ex-intimates, and more strangers in terms of who our stalkers are. And so if you think about the context where older people find themselves and what are the opportunities for stalking there, because unfortunately all relationships can be stalking relationships. And so like when Anne was talking earlier about that expectation of trust, is it someone's children? Is it someone who they're relying on for any kind of care? Whether they're, paying that person, it's professional or it's more of a personal relationship. Is it an acquaintance, like if they are one of that small percentage that is in an assisted living facility or in even just, say an apartment complex for folks 50 plus, is it someone they're meeting through there? So thinking about the context where they're meeting folks and how all those relationships could possibly be stalking relationships. And while stalking skews on average nationally younger, we know our older adults are experiencing this as well. So yeah, it's our 18 to 24 adults that are experiencing the highest rates among adults. But that's still, over 10% between 50 and 64 experiencing stalking, as well as 4% over the age of 65. So that's nearly 1 in 20 people over 65. So it's not a crime that is limited to younger victims only, right? It's something that can absolutely happen. It's not identified for our younger victims, and I would guess that it's even less identified for our older victims. When we're talking about stalking. And just a few examples. I mean, if you look for stalking news, which again, I do every day because I'm fun, you will absolutely find older stalking victims. And so if you can go to the next slide, a few of these kind of ripped from the headlines. So, this first case, it was a stranger stalking an elderly man who, found him at a gas station and insisted that he give her a ride somewhere, and then just kept contacting him and demanding things from him. We see financial abuse intersecting. We see, this one was a caregiver who was stalking and abusing a vulnerable adult who is older. And so there's a variety of, again, contexts and relationships in which we see older adults being targeted. So in addition to what's already been mentioned, there are so many stalking behaviors. And if I wanted to list them all, we'd be here forever, which I'm sure you would love, but I won't do that to you. But because stalkers, and I don't mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are very creative criminals. People always tell me the most bizarre, disturbing cases are stalking cases, because if you think about it, definitionally, it is about going out of your way just to scare somebody else. That is the entire point of it. And so a lot of times when folks think stalking, they think surveillance. But anything scary that isn't the first thing that's happened could be part of a stalking case, right? And so I think this framework's really helpful. It's by this wonderful researcher, T.K. Logan, to help us just kind of expand our thinking on stalking and all the different behaviors that can happen. And so I'm going to go through these in a few examples of each. And of course, feel free to share in the chat if you were with a victim experiencing any of these or can just think of some examples. It'd be great to hear what's going on the ground. So the first and these overlap and intersect, and that's fine. It's just to kind of expand our thinking. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is the offender tracking, watching, monitoring, getting information about our victim? And so we see that through technology, and I saw someone ask about technology already, that putting a GPS on the person's vehicle or hacking into their accounts, or putting a secret camera somewhere or something like that. But it also, not all, but most stalkers who are stalking using technology are also stalking in person. So good old fashioned driving by the home, going through the trash, going through the mail, asking friends and family where that person is. That really can't be overstated. Maybe that victim has blocked the offender on, say, Facebook, but because they know each other, they have those mutual social networks, the offender can still see some things that the victim's doing. They'll see some pictures pop up from them because of that mutual friendship. Or sometimes it's an offender just calling, saying, hey, when's their shift? I need to drop something off. Or did they make it home okay? It's snowing outside. I'm just worried. I'm going to call the neighbor and ask. And so that's called proxy stalking. That's stalking through third parties. And often those third parties have no idea they're helping a stalker. Sometimes they do. Sometimes that offender is like, I have a protective order. You go check up on this person, report back to me. That absolutely happens as well. But those third parties often sharing information. So if you think about, where, again, the person is, the context where this older person is finding themselves, who's in their community, who has information about them, and are they also kind of briefed, hey, maybe don't share all of that, when all their appointments are, how are they getting there, etc. Life invasion is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there. So the victim's just trying to get through their day, and there's the stalker assigned to the stalker. So we see that most commonly through texting, calling, constant contact, right? Most of us have our phones on us all day, and so they're across applications, they're calling on the home phone, they're emailing, just that constant, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. We also see sending packages or leaving gifts. And one common form of invasion that I want to highlight is one that it sounds like Velva experienced, which is property invasion, in which an offender breaks into a victim's vehicle or residence and doesn't take or break anything, but just leaves some sign they were there. So, they're not taking anything of value, but they're leaving some sign or moving things around. So maybe they move a lamp they one time argued with the victim about where it should go. Or they put the TV on a channel they used to watch together. And so the victim gets, let's say, home. They know that offender's been there, but they're like, what am I going to do? Call the police and say someone moved a lamp? I'm going to sound crazy. And offenders know that. That's why they engage in this behavior. And it's arguably even worse for our older victims who might be kind of stereotyped as, oh, they're delusional, they're imagining things, right? And it can kind of feed into all that and make it even worse than for our average age victims. So if a victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that should be a red flag. This might be a stalking case because offenders are engaging in those behaviors really intentionally that are often contextual in nature and hard to prove. We also see interference. That's what is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior. So that could be tampering with accounts or money. It could be property damage, like I slashed my tire, I can't get to work, right? That interferes with my day. It could be physical or sexual attack. Or intimidation. Hopefully you can see how all the behaviors I mentioned would be intimidating contextually, right? But we do see those direct threats as well, that I will harm you, I'll do this to you, I'll do that to you, symbolic violence like a gesture or a crushed can, threats to harm oneself or threats to harm others. That's really scary to a victim. So here are some of the most common stalking behaviors. Over here, I think on our next slide. And so this is what the majority of folks are reporting, some combination of these, right? That unwanted contact, spreading rumors is what I want to highlight. And so way back when I started talking, if you can remember that far long ago, I had those 3 scenarios. And one of them was an ex-partner repeatedly spreading vicious rumors on social media. Is that stalking? And you were all split about half and half. And I'd say of those 3 scenarios, that's the most likely to be stalking because spreading rumors and public humiliation are often part of a stalking case. So you may be thinking, well, people gossip. That's not necessarily stalking. And you're right. But we see some very intentional spreading of rumors and damaging information. So, for example, there's been a lot of cases where offenders have either distributed or completely created or had, for whatever reason, intimate photos of a victim, let's say. And so they create a flyer with that intimate photo, write a bunch of rumors about what the victim likes sexually, and distribute it to everyone in the victim's apartment building or their workplace. And so obviously that's beyond an, oh, people gossip, right? It's spreading rumors and humiliating and really sabotaging that victim because that victim's trying to get through their day normally. They don't know who's seen these photos. They're being approached by people talking about them. They're not being taken seriously in the workplace or in their home. And so that kind of humiliation and spreading rumors, we see that also through impersonation online, through making, for example, a fake social media profile or a fake dating profile, really quite easy to do, and spreading rumors through that. And so when most people see that, they don't think, oh, a stalking case, but often it is. And so by the time, if it is prosecuted, it goes to a judge, you have the sense of, well, it looks like everyone's kind of a mess, or, well, this victim's not credible. Look at all the crazy stuff they've been into, when really it was the offender manipulating that entire thing. And so we see that as well through, making false CPS claims, taking out a protective order against the victim, right? Just trying to discredit that victim. And so that's something to be aware of. And most stalkers are doing more than one of these things. They're picking and choosing, again, both in person and through technology, using a variety of strategies. And so if you're screening for stalking behavior, if you're working with a victim and thinking, is this stalking? Is it harassment? Is it something else? Ask about all the behaviors that I mentioned. So if you can go to the next slide here, because if you ask a victim, are you experiencing stalking? They're probably going to say, no, it's not stalking. But if you ask them about these more specific questions about the categories, that can be really powerful. So they might end up saying, have they tracked or followed you in any way? Well, yeah, I think they were kind of driving behind me a couple times, but I'm not sure. And yes, they do call me a lot, when they know I'm home in the evening, because they don't usually leave a message, but yeah, they have interfered with my life. I think they were kind of in my Facebook account, so you might get more information when you ask those more specific questions about stalking behavior. And again, most stalkers are using more than one means of approach. They're not just doing one thing. And 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims. If you can go to the next slide here, and I'll send these to you so you can look at them all day. You know, 2/3 of stalkers are pursuing their victims at least once a week. Many pursue daily. And like I said earlier, the average duration of a stalking case is 2 years. And so what this all means is that stalkers have plenty of time to change their behaviors. And so for you as the responder, no, of course you can't read the future. You can't know exactly what an offender will do. But I encourage you when you're safety planning with a victim to think about the diversity of stalking behaviors and not just focus on what's already happened, but as much as realistically possible, be predictive of what might happen next. You know, ask what access or information or knowledge does this offender have about this victim? And talk to your victim about, you know, here's some common behavior stalkers do. Do you think they might do this? Do you think they might do that? Because they're unlikely to stick with just what they've already done. They're likely to escalate or at least shift gears and do something else as well. And so thinking about safety and how an offender might react when a victim changes their behavior to avoid the stalker can be really critical to kind of just be as predictive as possible. Because so many behaviors are part of it. Also, a lot of crimes can be part of a stalking case. So I'll turn it back to Anne to speak to that.
Thank you, Dana. I love, you are a wealth of information and I love your enthusiasm. Especially I get the whole, like, I'm the girl who took a pile of healthcare advanced directives on a girls' weekend. So I get the whole like being super nerdy and wanting people to be as enthusiastic about things as you are. So I feel you. We are going to talk about stalking within the context of other crimes. Stalkers have a very high recidivism rate and often violate orders of protection. So unfortunately, stalking, because it can be comprised of acts that are not criminal, like leaving a cup of coffee on someone's car. It's often not identified, unfortunately, until one of these other crimes occurs. So because stalking crimes often increase in severity as time goes on, as if the perpetrator is sort of testing the waters to see what they can get away with. Like, well, okay, if I tried that, then next I'm gonna, try something a little bit more serious. They may start with something like trespassing or theft and work their way up to something much more violent. So I think what's really important here is, like Dana said, a lot of the behaviors were not identified as stalking until after the fact, until something much more severe had happened. So how can we prevent these sorts of things from happening? Dana, is there anything you wanted to add about intersection with other crimes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, from a criminal justice perspective, what we always say is if you can't charge stalking, charge something. And from a victim service perspective, encourage your victim to document and save and report everything, right? Because most criminal codes have a variety of nonviolent crimes included. And one thing that's one of my pet peeves is victims will say, well, I was told no one had hurt me yet, so they couldn't do anything. Well, that's not accurate. There's plenty of nonviolent crimes. And so when I'm training a specific state, I always actually go through the criminal code and pull things out. So if in your state, it might be that like harassing phone calls, that's illegal in a bunch of states. So if on day one you have harassing phone calls and day two you have, loitering, okay, I understand I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you now have a stalking case, right? You have two or more behaviors that would cause fear. But if you didn't document, save the evidence of, report, charge, et cetera, that harassing phone call, now we don't have two. Now we're starting with one again. And so even if the behavior seems minor relatively to, how bad these things can get, I encourage you to, again, encourage the victim to, save, document, and if they are going the criminal justice route, to report. And if you're on that criminal justice side, charge whatever you can if you can't charge stalking, because these co-occurring crimes can really help build that course of conduct as well, and or have some accountability for that offender if you don't end up being able to charge stalking.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. And so one of the main, go ahead.
I was just going to throw it back to you for stalking and interpersonal violence. So I see a familiar wheel coming up here.
Yeah, so like we said, domestic violence is one of the major intersecting crimes, right? With about half of stalking victims and being related to intimate partner violence. About half the time it's a current or former intimate partner. So we look at our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is you've seen before. Really, this is highlighting the different ways that power and control can be used in a relationship beyond or in addition to physical and sexual violence. I know I like to think of abuse as kind of control by any means necessary. And so that might include physical or sexual violence, but it could also include financial exploitation, using privilege, isolating the person, or otherwise doing something so that the victim does what the offender wants. So that's like a terrible short explanation of what abuse is. So definitely, if you haven't gotten that training, get that training elsewhere. That did not count. But the reason I bring this up is that a lot of times in our field, if folks do talk about stalking and domestic violence, I hear it talked about like this, where people will say, okay, it was an abusive relationship, the victim left, and then the offender began stalking that victim. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, the offender is contacting constantly, putting a GPS on the car, asking friends and family where they are, demanding check-ins, that's stalking, right? It's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse or financial abuse. And it's stalking. It's both. It can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. And go to the next slide here. You'll see that about half the time it's happening during the relationship as well. And while these statistics aren't specific to elder abuse, I would argue that the same pattern here happens, right? In terms of, you might say, well, this, caretaker or caregiver was really exploitative, but then the victim got away from them, but then they started stalking them. And again, that can totally happen. But if during the relationship or during the course of that professional or personal relationship, they were doing some of these things, that's stalking. And it can happen before, during, and or after. And we want to know, to focus back on intimate partner violence specifically, we want to know when stalking is happening during a relationship. Because while all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, on average, our intimate partner stalkers are our most dangerous stalkers. And so what I mean by that, if you can go to the next slide here, they're the most likely to physically approach the victim, be interfering, insulting, and threatening, use weapons to threaten or harm, have their behaviors escalate quickly. And while the recidivism rate is high across the board for our stalking offenders, it's especially high for our intimate partner offenders. And if you think about why this might be, it's really about that information and access, right? Because who knows us better than our intimate partners? And so they know that victim's schedule, habits, locations. They also know that victim's fears and what will uniquely terrify that victim, which is really what stalking is about. And also just the access, right? That they might have. They might know their passwords. They know their sister's phone number. They know they have these different points of access to get to that victim. And so that's why generally the closer somebody is or was to the victim, the more dangerous on average they tend to be. Another study reinforcing this was a study of women with protective orders. If you can go to the next slide here. So all these women have been abused. All of them have protective orders. Some of the women were abused and stalked. For the women abused and stalked, they had higher rates of all of these harms across the board. Everything from verbal abuse and threats to severe physical violence, sexual violence, threats with a weapon, being beat up, attack with a weapon, and injury. And so, again, across the board, when there is abuse and stalking, there are higher threats from verbal abuse to injury. Now, I'm not saying stalking causes these other harms. What I am saying is it's an indicator that if you see stalking in an intimate partner relationship, whether it's during or after, that should be a big red flag that, hey, this might be an especially urgent case, but this victim's probably experiencing multiple kinds of victimization. And speaking of multiple kinds of victimization, we see that sexual violence victimization as well. And so that can
really quick, Dana?
Oh, go ahead.
It totally
Jump in.
Because you're talking about protective orders, I would just love to encourage people to take a look at the statutes in your jurisdiction that relate to protective orders, because I think a lot of people assume that to get a restraining order, you have to have been the victim of violence, or it has to be an intimate partner, it has to be a certain relationship. I cannot speak for every jurisdiction, but in Wisconsin, we have the domestic violence restraining order, but we also have a harassment injunction, and that the definition of harassment under that particular statute really is parallel to the definition we're using here today of what stalking is. It's engaging, the statutory definition, and do not quote me exactly, is something like engaging in a pattern of conduct that is designed to cause fear or harass or intimidate and serves no legitimate purpose. So that's where you go. And I think a lot of times somebody in the comments said, my biggest frustration is when the police say it's a civil matter and nothing can be done. Well, that is not true. A lot of times, no disrespect to any law enforcement who might be on the call, but a lot of times people are looking to end the call and, not do any more paperwork at the end of the shift. And that's, whenever I hear it's just a civil matter, I always tell people to get back on the phone and call the precinct and talk to a captain. So I just wanted to throw in a strong suggestion that you guys check the statutes in your areas. So
yeah, absolutely. No, I'm so glad you raised that, because you're absolutely right. It's not just for in a lot of jurisdictions, it's not just for intimate partner. It's not just after violence or a direct threat of violence. So figuring out what's going on in your state and locally, what the expectations are, because I've seen that vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction, even within the same state using the same statute, in terms of what is required for that victim to get that protective order. So it's definitely a good thing to know. Just really quickly, I know you don't believe me because I talk too much, but one of the sexual violence intersections, a stalker, these can intersect a few different ways. A stalker may threaten to sexually assault the victim. So maybe their intimidating course of conduct has a sexual tone to it. Their threats may be of a sexual nature, or their threats may be not sexual assault, but perhaps releasing an intimate photo or spreading sexual rumors or something like that. They might actually assault the victim in the course of conduct. That's one of the crimes. Or sometimes the stalking actually begins with sexual violence, and then there's contact after, that intimidation after, to say you better not report, or this will happen again or I'll release these photos, or whatever. So that contact after the sexual violence can actually become stalking. I won't spend a long time on this, but just to point out that if we think about grooming for sexual violence, if you think about it through the lens of stalking, I would argue it is also stalking, right? So that repeated contact where they're targeting someone specific, particularly most offenders are targeting someone, and this is not every kind of sexually violent offender, but there is that kind of repeat offender that is looking for a vulnerable person, and they do this again and again. So finding someone who seems vulnerable or isolated, contacting them, building trust, saying, I understand you, I'm so attracted to you, I really see you in ways others don't, isolating them, committing the sexual act, and then contacting them after. We see this kind of repeat pattern for certain kind of sexually violent repeat offenders, and it's sexual violence and it's stalking, really that grooming process, that repeated contact, because fear can attach at any time. You might have a victim say, well, I wasn't scared on day one when they said, oh, you look so good. I was flattered, right? But when I look back on it and realize our entire relationship was a setup for the sexual violence, that's terrifying. And it all started with that first time. Okay, that could still be stalking. And so that grooming really is stalking as well, and that researching someone to see if they could commit another crime, whether that crime is sexual violence or something like a property crime, financial exploitation, etc. Sometimes that stalking is happening to gain information in order to access them for another crime. So just really quickly on the use of technology to stalk. Of course, this is its whole own topic, and I'm happy to talk to you more about it if you want further training on it. But I just want to point out that, of course, stalkers are using technology to stalk, and that our older adults use technology, right? I think sometimes there's this misperception that older adults either don't use technology or that they use, they don't understand it, etc. Of course, there are a lot of types of technology. None of us understand it completely. We're all trying to keep up. And also there's a difference between our older adults and our younger older adults, right? And so there's our older adults who are 50 plus, or older adults who are 80 plus. And those are different populations who might have different technology use. So I don't want to overly lump people together. So our younger seniors tend to have higher rates of technology use than our older seniors. But most own cell phones, many own smartphones, most use the internet, about a third use social media. And so we need to recognize that technology can absolutely be used to reach and to engage in stalking these older adults as well as our younger adults. There's a lot of technology used to stalk, but some of the most common, of course, we see, when I think about technology and stalking, I always want to say technology doesn't cause stalking, right? It's a tool that can be used or misused by a stalker. That being said, used to have to get up off the couch to stalk, and now there's an app for that, right? And so there's certainly a lot more opportunities, and pretty much every stalking behavior I mentioned can be enhanced or facilitated through technology. And so that contact, right, whether it's calls, messages across applications, Facebook message, text message, email, cameras, whether planted in the home. And again, the technology is neutral, right? A camera can be used. Some stalking victims love having, say, the, I'm forgetting what it's called, the Ring camera, like it's the doorbell, and it shows when someone's coming to the home. How great for a stalking victim to record if the offender comes by, or to be able to make sure that their home is safe when they're gone. The problem is if an offender gains access to that account, now the offender's watching the home and seeing who comes by, right? And so it can really go different ways. But cameras getting smaller and less expensive. GPS, so either hacking into GPS on somebody's phone or a device they're already using, or planting a GPS device, or there's been a lot of air tags in the news lately, watching what they do on social media, emailing them, installing stalkerware, or hacking into or misusing assistive technologies can be a problem as well. And so a few signs that they might be using technology: they know where the victim is or was, they have access to the victim information that the victim never shared with that offender. Or they're referencing things that they shouldn't know. There's no way they would know that. Or if the victim's seeing, I'm locked out of accounts, I'm getting these different notifications, passwords are changed, etc. So a very brief overview of technology, but just to mention that we see that integrated, and that there are some really great tools to learn more. The National Network to End Domestic Violence Tech Safety Team has a really great app. A lot of settings are not intuitive. It's not intuitive that if you text someone a photo, it might include location information, for example. Not obvious to anyone. And so this can help just think through some of those different settings and take control, as well as password safety, etc. I know there's a toolkit especially for older adults as well.
Yes, I wanted to, and I think Anna's going to throw this link in the chat if she didn't already, but we created, along with NNEDV, a toolkit that we released in November of 2020 on tech safety in older adults. So again, some checklists you can use, some advice. I think our plan is to be updating that in the near future because it does seem like Dana mentioned air tags. It just seems like there's something new out there all the time. But if you're looking for a place to start to sort of do a tech check and get some more resources and information on tech safety in older adults, please feel free to download that. Everything on our website is, as always, free.
Just quickly, because I know we're short on time here, which is 100% my fault, and I will stick around at the end if folks have questions. Just to recognize that, sure, older adults can be victims. They can also be offenders, right? And so, we see some examples of older adult offenders as well, that it can certainly go both ways. In that, at least in this study on stalking and age, there were some interesting trends with our older stalkers. So those age 60 plus, if you can go to the next slide here, they were the least likely to target same-sex victims. And so they're more likely to target opposite sex. And could you switch to the next slide? Or at least it's not moving for me.
Oh,
but what happened? Yeah, there it goes.
Okay.
But they're actually the most likely to actually injure their victims. And they're more likely, most stalking is taking place around the same age group, but our older stalkers are a little more likely to target younger acquaintances or younger folks. So just some trends to be aware of in terms of our older stalkers as well.
Super interesting. Thank you. And we have already, just getting into some of the challenges of reporting and responding. We've already gone through many of these already. Obviously, older adults face issues around ageism and stereotypes about their abilities and characteristics, and how how our perceptions might be impacted and how they might affect our response and our ability to provide services to somebody who says they are being abused or exploited. For example, and I touched on this before, somebody might question why a stalker would ever, quote, need or want to stalk an older victim, which is, just ageism and inaccurate. When older adults report or seek support, they may encounter assumptions about whether they have some form of dementia. Are they really relating what happened to them? Or maybe they were misunderstanding. Those are assumptions that do not happen to younger victims generally. So We know that that can result in our minimizing the threat against and faced by an older victim. Maybe we are assuming that medications are impacting their ability to process things or their ability to communicate things. So, long story short, these sorts of assumptions result in delayed or denied justice for older victims. So as we saw in the Velva case, it took up to the 9th visit by police for somebody to do something. So I think, education and awareness are key to assuring that older adults can be believed and receive the services and response that they need in order to be safe. This is a little bit more from the National Stalking Study. We're looking here again at the impact of the issue of ageism and stereotypes on older victims. This study also noted that when older victims report stalking, they're often told either, by the authorities or by family or by a friend or pastor that they're overreacting and that the threat level that they're facing is really not that serious. Many older adults who participated in this study also noted that after reporting, they were left feeling 66.7% said that they were left feeling as though they were not taken seriously. And a lot of that was already covered in Velva's story. So I think we just need to, all of us, not to dump on law enforcement at all here, but I think all of us need to check ourselves that when we hear somebody who is older reporting some sort of activity or threat to them, are we making those assumptions? Are we taking them as seriously as we would if this person was 25? So when victims of stalking do seek support and assistance when they're dealing with a stalking issue, we see that most victims first try to get help from family and friends. Then folks like attorneys or an employer, the justice system, mental health professionals, faith leaders, and other community-based advocates. I think that these statistics are helpful in that they provide some indicator of how you guys can think about effective ways to assist older victims, whether they're coming to you or if you could be collaborating and sort of working together with any of these other entities in your own work. And then again, what's interesting about the research that we have had in the case of older adults who are stalked is that they are less likely than younger victims to be helped by friends and family and less likely to access effective services and supports to deal with stalking. We talk a lot in our other trainings about how systems and services for victims of domestic violence are often not designed for older victims. They are, when we think about a victim of domestic violence, I think in our brains you picture a younger mom with kids, and we know that that victims of domestic violence are all genders and all ages and all family structures, and it is the same with stalking. So just some things to keep in mind. And then last, in terms of the impact of stalking on older adults, this is true for all forms of elder abuse. That study after study and story after story that we hear from older adults shows that the experience of that abuse dramatically increases the rate of morbidity and mortality for older victims. So victims of all forms of elder abuse are 3 times more likely to die prematurely than non-abused older adults. And it is no different for stalking. So just some things that you can think about as you think about the services that you provide and the way that you are interacting with older victims in your own work. Are we recognizing that stalking is stalking, or are we just calling it elder abuse and sort of discounting it that way? Are there disadvantages of labeling it as elder abuse? I think that as a form of abuse, it is much more common, as we've already talked about, than is actually, statistically what we believe it to be true. I think these questions are good to consider when you think about how you work with older victims in your communities and ways that you can enhance your services and supports that you may be providing to older victims of stalking. If you have any questions or thoughts about these or responses to these questions, I would invite you to share those in the chat. I think there's a lot in there when we talk about how we provide services. While you do that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dana to talk about some of the resources available to you guys. And I'll shoot it back to you.
All right, thanks. I know we're just at time here, so I'll try to be brief and I'll stick around if there are questions afterwards. So of course, understanding if folks have to hop off right at the 30 mark, we totally understand that.
And we will have this will be posted on our website in the coming weeks. So if you have to jump off, we will have the recording available.
All right, great. That's great to know. So in terms of, sorry, just with Anne asking, well, should we name stalking? That's actually one of our major points at Spark. Our campaign every year is stalking, know it, name it, stop it. And that's because we think naming stalking is really, really critical. One, for those criminal justice implications, let's charge it when we can. One, for safety planning, that when you recognize that someone's experiencing stalking, they're also more likely to be experiencing other forms of victimization. And if you realize someone's experiencing stalking, that should activate that. Okay, I'm going to think about surveillance, life invasion, interference. I'm going to think about stalking behavior and all those different co-victimizations. If we just call it elder abuse or emotional abuse, we miss that chance to recognize that indicator of potential other victimizations, violence. And again, that intimate partner homicide connection is huge. Stalking increases the risk of intimate partner homicide 3 times. And so if we miss that there's stalking going on, we kind of miss that extra red flag. And even victim empowerment, even for a victim just to be able to say, instead of my ex is being creepy, to be able to say, you know, I'm experiencing stalking, and that's a real thing. And if I Google it, something will come up, right? Even that can go a long way. So when we're responding to victims, a few very big picture tips. You want to advise disengagement with the stalker, and that's because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if they call 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, don't call me again, tomorrow they're calling 101 times. That being said, that disengagement is not always possible or realistic, and we need to think about that. So, you know, we do have victims reach out to offenders to kind of take the temperature of the situation and keep their enemies closer. So, for example, there was a victim who called the offender at 2 a.m. They talked for hours. And so the defense is saying, well, how scared can she be? If she's so scared, why would she call him? Because, again, stalking is all about fear. So we asked the victim, and the victim said, yeah, because I could hear him get off work at the bar, get in his car, drive home, and fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over and break my windows again and wake up my neighbors. Okay, perfectly reasonable, right? So I think that, you know, it's both advised disengagement because of that reinforcement and recognize that may not always be possible. So there's hard and fast rules in your jurisdiction. Like there's jurisdictions where if a victim reaches out to an offender, they will drop that protective order. Make sure your victim knows that, but keep the dialogue open. It's not like they did something bad, right? Documentation. We always mentioned, we keep saying it's so important, but we don't always tell victims how to document. So something like this tool can help. This is our documentation log, free on our website. If you can go to the next slide, we have it in English and Spanish, very succinct. So just date, time, what happened, where did it happen, a lot of jurisdictional issues in stalking cases, and most victims don't understand jurisdiction. So they feel like I called the police, and they may not realize, oh, that was over the county line, that was different than when you visited your kids a state away. You know, where did the stalking take place? Those folks are probably not coordinating. If there were witnesses, their information, if police were called or any authority figure, you know, front desk security, anything like that, the report number and the officer name and badge number. And that's to help connect the dots, because there might be a different responding officer every time. And so when they get that call about the coffee cup in the car, they're not responding with urgency. And unfortunately, a lot of victims say, well, every time I call, it feels like the first time. And the thing is, these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math. And something like this can help, along with saving that evidence. And, you know, don't delete that upsetting text message, take a screenshot, you know, and doing some education with your victims about keeping all that and document everything. Of course, what we need most of all is much easier said than done, which is that coordination. We really need everyone to get together on this, because typically in cases of stalking, especially, they're not uniquely those that result in homicide or extreme violence, it's not usually like one person just did a bad job, right? It's usually not like, oh, if that one officer had called it in, we would have been good to go here. It's really a system failure, because our system is not set up for stalking cases. It's set up to be incident-based. So we need everyone working together on this and having the right sense of urgency and coordination, because typically different parties know different things. Prosecutor knows something, law enforcement here knows something, victim services knows something else, and no one's connecting the dots. So we need our public awareness educators to make sure our general public understands what stalking is, that when that victim talks to a friend or family member, that person responds with the level of concern and helps get them to victim services instead of dismissing it. We need our victim service providers to identify stalking as a unique victimization, to safety plan appropriately. We need our law enforcement to identify it and charge it. We need our prosecutors to pick up those charges and argue it effectively. We need our courts to have appropriate sentencing. We need our probation, parole, and corrections folks to continue to hold that offender accountable and keep that victim safe. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And I know you don't want that happening anywhere where you are. And the truth is, it's no one's job to make this happen. And now, after this 90 minutes, you now know more about stalking than most people. And so it kind of is up to you in whatever role that you play. If you identify this as a stalking victim, to think to yourself, this could be urgent, and most people may not recognize that. But I do, and do everything in your power to help that victim navigate the system and connect the dots as best as you can. A couple resources to do so. There is a risk assessment specifically for stalking. It's very great, and I love it. You can check it out for free. We have a recorded webinar going through it. So if you're working with a stalking victim, I highly recommend this risk assessment. And then, of course, you can get to it from our website, which has some of these other things as well, in-person trainings or online trainings, as we're doing increasingly, individual organizational assistance. So if you're working with a stalking victim and just want to talk it through with someone, you can feel free to reach out to us. Webinars like this one, and of course, January Stalking Awareness Month materials. Of course, everyone's favorite website, you know it, you love it, stalkingawareness.org, where you can get a bunch of the materials referenced today. Victim Connect is the closest thing we have to a stalking hotline. So if you're ever sharing like the RAIN hotline, the DV hotline, make sure you share Victim Connect as well. It's out of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and they'll help refer our stalking victims to local resources. And Spark's a project of Equitas. So if you're working with prosecutors, working around charging stalking, digital evidence, anything like that, free 24/7 technical assistance on accountability for those stalking offenders. With that, I'll hand it back to Anne for some more resources.
Excellent. I'm not going to talk too much about the grant program because we're way over time, but I do want to mention that we will be sending out a PDF of these slides to everybody who participated today. So if you had to jump off, you can't hear me right now, but if you want to share these with your colleagues, you can. I do want to mention that you should stay connected to NCAL. We've got a ton of resources as well, including some self-assessment tools that you can use to evaluate your organization's response to elder abuse. We have those for all kinds of organizations, prosecutors, courts, law enforcement, advocacy agencies. And then we're on all the socials as well. We also have outreach and awareness for all the awareness months, like what we're in right now. But also for World Elder Abuse Awareness Day and Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We have materials that you can download and share and use on your own in your own observations of these months. So I would invite you to check those out. I also want to mention one more resource. We are going to be announcing the release of a number of training modules for law enforcement, interactive training modules. And one of those is on stalking. It does contain, thanks to Dana, a lot of the information that you have seen here today, but that is an online interactive training that law enforcement can do on their own time. It's all free. So please sign up for our newsletter on our website. And when that is released to the public, we will blast out an email. Very sorry that we have gone long today, but it's 100% worth it. I think next year we're just going to budget an hour and 45 minutes because there is nothing I would want to cut. Thank you so much, Dana, for being here and for all the terrific information and resources. I think this is always a joy to do with you. So thank you. And thanks for everybody who's stuck around today. We appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Anne, and to NCAL for having us and for highlighting this issue. I really appreciate it. And for folks on the call, I know it's hard to join, get another webinar at this point in the pandemic. And it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, do this, think about this, use these tools. But you're the ones who are actually on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done, and I totally understand and respect that. So thank you so much for the work that you do and for your attention to this issue. And please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any further assistance around your stalking accountability and safety needs. So I hope that we do hear from you. And yeah, my pleasure as always, Anne. So much fun to talk stalking with you. So thank all so much.
Thanks, everybody.